Silence swallowed the kitchen. The overhead lights hummed their mechanical hymn, fluorescent and cold, casting everything in a sickly white glow. The stainless steel pass-through gleamed like a blade, and beyond it, through the small rectangular window, the private booth sat cloaked in candlelight and shadow. Summer thunder cracked the sky open outside, and rain hammered against the back door in waves so thick they sounded like breaking glass. Elena Hartley burst through the kitchen doors at 11:43 p.m., her body moving faster than her mind could follow. 27 years old but looking decades older from exhaustion and trauma, her hair plastered to her pale face in wet ropes, her nanny uniform torn at the shoulder. Blood soaked through the fabric on her left arm. It streaked down her ribs in dark tributaries, most of it hers from the freezer door handle that had cut her during the struggle, some from Harold Brennan's nose when she'd fought back hard enough to escape. She was shaking, gasping for breath. Mascara ran down her cheeks like ink dissolving in water. The three men in expensive black suits, Marco, Franco, and a third bodyguard whose name she did not know, froze mid-conversation. They'd been standing near the pass-through window, shoulders relaxed, the kind of men who moved through the world believing nothing could touch them. Their hands moved toward concealed weapons with the smooth precision of 1,000 practiced moments. Elena stumbled forward, leaving wet bloody footprints on the white tile floor. Each step rang out against the silence, a sound like accusation. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking the way thin ice breaks beneath weight. "He's going to come after me. I just need—" Marco stepped forward, blocking her path. His suit cost more than everything she owned. His cologne smelled like sandalwood and money. His voice came out flat, rehearsed, the way security spoke to problems they didn't care about solving. "Wrong place, wrong time, lady. Turn around. Walk out the way you came." But Elena didn't turn around. Her eyes caught on something taped to the kitchen wall near the stairs leading up to the second floor. A child's drawing. Crayon on white paper, crude and trembling with the hand of someone very young. 3 stick figures holding hands. A family. Yellow sun in the corner. The kind of drawing that broke your heart because the child who'd drawn it had believed in simple things like families that stayed together. She had the same drawing crumpled in her jacket pocket. Oliver had drawn it 3 nights ago, the 6-year-old boy with the failing heart valve, the one she'd been nannying for $400 a week under the table because she had no social security number and nowhere else to go. He'd drawn their family, him, his parents, Elena. He'd drawn them holding hands. Then his parents told her they were letting her go. Something hardened in Elena's eyes. The shaking stopped. She straightened despite the pain that lanced through her ribs where the freezer door had caught her, where Harold Brennan had pushed her against the metal corner and whispered filthy things about what happened to girls who rejected men like him. "I said move," Marco growled, reaching for her arm. "There's a child upstairs," Elena said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I can hear the medical equipment from here." The men froze. Marco's hand hung suspended in the air. In the back booth, cloaked in the flickering glow of candlelight and shadow, Lucian Moretti's head turned slightly. Just slightly. Enough to suggest he was listening. Enough to make the air in the kitchen contract like a held breath. He was a man constructed from stone. Dark hair, thick and expensively cut, fell across his forehead. His face bore a scar running from the corner of his left eye to his cheekbone, a thin white line that looked like a question mark. He wore a black suit so flawlessly tailored it looked like it had been poured onto him, and beneath it, an open white shirt revealed the broad carved landscape of his chest. Gold watch on his left wrist. A single silver ring on his right hand. Everything about him whispered of a man who had built an empire on blood and had no interest in apologizing for it. Lucian had not moved like that in 3 years. Not since the night a rival family's bullet had taken his son's ability to walk. 3 years of motionless silence. 3 years of a man suspended in stone. A child who needs someone who gives a damn, Elena continued, her voice shaking but fierce, the words tumbling out like she couldn't stop them now that they'd started. "And you're all down here playing security theater while." Thunder cracked across the sky. The kind of thunder that felt like the sky itself was breaking apart. The lights in the kitchen flickered once, twice, and for a moment everything went dark except for the lightning that turned the world into photographic negatives. When the light returned, Marco had lowered his hand. Lucian Moretti had turned fully in his seat now. His eyes, dark and penetrating as a predator's, fixed on the bleeding girl in the torn uniform who had just challenged the security apparatus of the most dangerous man in Chicago. "What is your name?" His voice came out deep and solid like an oath, like the sound of a door closing on a life. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Marco, then at Franco, then at the third bodyguard. All three of them were staring at their boss with expressions that suggested they had just witnessed something impossible. "Elena," she whispered. "Elena Hartley." "How did you get in here, Elena Hartley?" "The back door. The chef gave me a ride, and I got out at the corner because I thought Harold was following me, and I saw the light on and I thought," her words fragmented like she was falling apart in real time. "I thought someone would help. I thought—" "You are bleeding," Lucian said. It was not a question. "I'm fine. I just need to call the police. He assaulted me. He cornered me in the freezer and he wouldn't take no for an answer, and when I fought back, she looked down at the blood on her arm as if surprised it was still there. It's not that bad." Marco glanced at his boss. Lucian did not acknowledge him. His entire attention remained fixed on the girl who was dripping blood onto the white tile floor of the most exclusive restaurant in Chicago. "Sit," Lucian commanded, and something in the word suggested that sitting was not a request but a law of physics that could not be defied. Elena sat in the closest chair, which happened to be at one of the kitchen preparation tables. The vinyl seat was cold under her thighs. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't control them. Franco disappeared without being told. He returned 60 seconds later with a first aid kit, a towel, and a bottle of water. He set them in front of Elena and retreated to the shadows without speaking. "Tell me everything," Lucian said. "From the beginning." And Elena, sitting in a kitchen in the most exclusive restaurant in Chicago, bleeding into a stolen towel, surrounded by men who killed people for a living, began to speak. She told him about the job. The nanny position with the Blackstone family, which had turned out to be a lie from the beginning. She told him about Cordelia Blackwood, the wealthy owner of Lucian's, the one who had hired her through a false employment agency that didn't exist, who had paid her in cash to keep her off the books, who had paid her less and less each week until the $400 she'd been promised had become $200, then $150, then sometimes nothing at all because you made a mistake with Oliver's breakfast and didn't earn it today. She told him about the $22,000. That number hung in the air like a curse. $22,000. That was how much Oliver's heart surgery cost. That was the amount a 6-year-old boy needed to survive, and his parents had made it clear they couldn't afford it, and they'd hired Elena on the promise that they'd pay her enough to help them save. It had been a lie. Everything had been a lie. She told him about the $34 remaining in her pocket. $34. That was all that was left of everything she'd saved in 2 years of working 3 jobs, living in a basement room that cost $600 a month, eating food from the dollar store and leftovers stolen from the trash behind restaurants. She told him about Harold Brennan, the manager of this very restaurant, who had been cornering her for weeks, who had whispered things to her while she worked, who had finally trapped her in the walk-in freezer at 11:08 p.m. and made it clear that the only way she was leaving this job without consequences was if she gave him what he wanted. She told him about the drawing. Oliver's drawing. The 3 stick figures holding hands. She'd fought so hard because she couldn't let anything happen to her, couldn't end up in a hospital, couldn't lose the 2 weeks of work she still had before the 10-day deadline that Cordelia had given her. 10 days until the labor board investigated her employment. 10 days until she lost her job entirely. 10 days until the $22,000 disappeared forever and Oliver's surgery became a dream that would die along with the boy. When she finished speaking, the kitchen was silent except for the sound of rain hammering against the windows, the constant percussion of a summer storm that showed no signs of ending. Lucian Moretti sat motionless in the candlelight, his dark eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the girl who was still bleeding, still trembling, still holding on to the belief that somehow, impossibly, someone might help her. "Marco," he said quietly. "Call the police. Tell them there was an assault at this address. Tell them to bring evidence collection. Tell them I want everything documented." Marco nodded and stepped away, already pulling his phone from his pocket. "Franco," Lucian continued. "Call Cordelia. Tell her I would like to speak with her. Tonight. At my office." Franco disappeared without a word. Then Lucian stood, moving with the kind of deliberate grace that suggested every moment had been choreographed long ago. He walked toward Elena, and she flinched instinctively. She couldn't help it. She'd spent the last hour fighting off a man's hands, and her body remembered. Lucian stopped walking. He understood, it seemed, that his approach was terrifying. He pulled a chair toward her and sat down across from her, his massive frame folding into the small chair as if it had been built for him. "Elena Hartley," he said, and her name sounded different when he said it. It sounded like something that mattered. "You are not going to lose your job in 10 days. How would you?" "Because I am about to own this restaurant," he said quietly. "In approximately 1 hour, I am going to call a lawyer. That lawyer will initiate a hostile acquisition of Lucian's from Cordelia Blackwood. She will not have a choice in the matter. And within those 10 days, you are not only going to keep your job, you are going to tell me what you need. Whatever you need, Elena Hartley. And I am going to give it to you." She stared at him. The words weren't making sense. They were rearranging themselves in her mind, refusing to form a coherent picture. "Why would you do that?" she whispered. "I'm nobody. I'm just—" "Because," Lucian Moretti said, and his voice carried the weight of 3 years of silence, 3 years of a man suspended in darkness, 3 years of watching his son lie motionless in a bed upstairs and wondering if the world had any mercy left in it at all. "The people who did this to you believed you were nobody. And that belief needs to be corrected." He stood, and when he did, the entire room seemed to shift on its axis. "We will talk more tomorrow," he said. "Tonight, you are going to the hospital. You are going to be examined. You are going to file a police report against Harold Brennan. And then you are going to get some sleep, because tomorrow, your life begins to change." And as Elena sat there, bleeding and shaking and unable to quite believe that what was happening was real, the thunder outside cracked one more time, and for just a moment, she could have sworn she felt the weight of a powerful man's attention, vast and patient as winter, turning in her direction like the sky itself had decided to finally look at her and recognize that she had been invisible for far too long. Before we continue, drop a like if this story hits you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming tomorrow. Now let us go back to the beginning, to understand how a nanny with $34 in her pocket and blood on her uniform ended up in the most dangerous restaurant in Chicago. 14 hours earlier, the apartment at the Blackwood Mansion on North Lakeshore Drive was still dark when Elena Hartley's eyes opened at 5:06 in the morning. The converted closet she called her bedroom measured 6 feet by 8 feet. No window. No clock. Just a narrow cot pushed into the corner, a hook on the wall where her 2 nanny uniforms hung like empty skins, and the sound of the city beginning to wake 3 stories below her. She lay still for a moment, listening to the building settle around her, feeling the cold seep through the thin blanket she had pulled from a donation bin for months ago. This was the part of her day she hated most, those first seconds after waking when her mind was still too foggy to remember that Oliver needed a $200,000 heart surgery in the next 14 days, that she had exactly $22,000 of it saved, that the hospital had sent a letter yesterday that said they would not wait forever. Then the fog cleared, and the weight settled back into her chest like a stone. Elena pulled herself up and dressed in the dark, her movements practiced and economical. The nanny uniform hung loose on her frame now. She had lost 11 pounds since arriving at the Blackwood house. She fastened the buttons with fingers that had learned not to tremble, braided her dark hair back from a face that showed no color except the bruises under her eyes, and checked the watch she had found in a thrift store. 5:58 a.m. She had 7 minutes before Emma would wake crying for her diaper to be changed. The mansion was a cathedral of quiet marble and glass, all vertical spaces and windows that looked out on Lake Michigan like eyes that never blinked. Elena moved through it like a ghost, like a shadow that refused to leave, present but unseen. In the kitchen she heated bottles, prepared breakfast, scrubbed the pans from yesterday. Her hands moved through these tasks with the efficiency of someone who had learned that stillness was a luxury she could not afford. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a gardener's truck rumbled past on the private drive. Somewhere in the upper floors, Cordelia Blackwood was still sleeping in Egyptian cotton that cost more than Elena's monthly rent. At 6:13 a.m., 3-year-old Emma began to cry, a small, thin sound that carried through the baby monitor like a prayer. Elena climbed the service stairs and found her standing in her crib, diaper sagging, face red and wet with tears. "It's all right, baby girl," Elena whispered, lifting her. "I'm right here." Emma grabbed her neck and buried her face in Elena's shoulder, and something in Elena's chest cracked a little wider. The morning routine unfolded in its familiar rhythm. She changed Emma's diaper and dressed her in a pink dress with embroidered butterflies. She braided Sophie's hair, the 8-year-old with her mother's blonde hair but her father's gentle eyes that looked at Elena like she was the center of the world. "You're my best friend, Elena," Sophie whispered while Elena worked the braid. "More than Mommy." Elena's hand stilled for just a moment. She forced them to keep moving. "Your mommy loves you in a different way, love. A mother's love is the strongest love there is." But Sophie shook her head. "Mommy is always sad. You're not sad with us." The truth of it landed like a knife, and Elena had to turn away and pretend she needed to find a hair ribbon. Jackson, 6 years old with his mother's sharp chin, sat at the kitchen island eating cereal and drawing pictures with a blue crayon on the back of yesterday's newspaper. He drew their house, or what he imagined it to be, with 3 stick figures standing in front of it, hands connected, smiling. He showed it to Elena with the serious expression of an artist unveiling a masterpiece. "This is our family," he said. Elena's throat tightened. She took the drawing and looked at the 3 figures for a long moment. Then she folded it carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket, where she kept everything that mattered. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Absolutely beautiful." At 8:15 a.m., she strapped the children into the back seat of the family's 3rd car, a silver Mercedes that was reserved for school runs and errands, and drove them to the private academy on East Division Street. The school building was all glass and blonde wood, the kind of place where children wore uniforms and learned to conjugate French verbs before they learned to tie their shoes. Elena watched them walk toward the entrance, their backpacks nearly as large as their bodies, and something in her wanted to call them back, to tell them not to disappear into that building, to stay close to her where it was safe. She drove back to the mansion and worked until 2:22 p.m., when Cordelia Blackwood appeared in the kitchen doorway like a verdict being delivered. Cordelia was 43 years old and looked 40 years old, her face pulled tight by money and anger, her blonde hair cut into a geometric shape that made her head look like a knife. She wore a dress that probably cost more than Elena's entire existence, and she held her arms crossed in front of her like a barricade. "Elena," she said, and her voice was exactly the temperature of the marble floors. "We need to discuss the children." Elena straightened from the sink, water dripping from her hands. She said nothing. Cordelia had taught her that silence was safer than words. "They are becoming too attached to you," Cordelia continued. "I've noticed it. Sophie barely looks at me anymore. She runs to you when she's upset. This is inappropriate. You need to maintain professional distance. I am their mother. You are the staff. There should be a clear line between those two things." Elena's hands gripped the edge of the counter. She wanted to say that children do not understand the difference between blood and care, that love is not something you measure in genetic percentages, that Sophie ran to her because someone had to. Instead, she said, "Of course, Miss Blackwood. I apologize. I will maintain better boundaries." Cordelia studied her for a moment, and something cruel flickered across her face. "See that you do. At 6:30, you'll go to Lucian's. Harold needs extra staff tonight for a private event. You'll work the back kitchen and the walk-in freezer. Do not speak to the guests. Do not be noticed. Simply do the work and return by midnight. It was not a request. Elena nodded and said, yes. She picked up the children at 3:15 p.m. and brought them home. She gave them snacks and let them play in the garden while she watched from the kitchen window, committing their faces to memory. At 5:45 p.m., she helped them with homework, read them a story, tucked them into their beds. Sophie grabbed her hand at the last moment. Will you be here when I wake up? She asked. Elena's voice caught. Yes, baby. I will be here. It was a lie. Everything was a lie. She was not their family. She was the help, and the help could be disposed of at any moment. She arrived at Lucian's at 7:45 p.m. wearing her nanny uniform because she owned nothing else that was clean. The restaurant was 3 stories of imported Italian marble and Edison bulbs that hung like golden eyes from a Corford ceiling. Even the service entrance was elegant, black iron doors and a brick courtyard where the wind moved between the buildings like something alive. Harold Brennan was waiting. He stood near the prep station, a man in his mid-40s with a scalp that was beginning to show through his thinning hair, wearing a suit that had been expensive 5 years ago. His eyes moved over her like something wet. Blackwood, he said, and his voice was venom poured into a glass. Glad you could make it. You'll be on the walk-in tonight. Inventory, organization, support. Got it? Yes, Elena said. Yes, what? Yes, sir. Better. Don't be useless. The evening blurred into repetition. She moved through the kitchen like a machine, following orders, staying invisible, counting the hours until she could return to the mansion and sleep in her 6x8 closet and pretend that none of this was happening. Other servers came and went. The kitchen clattered with the sounds of a restaurant in motion, metal on metal, the explosion of flames on the stove, voices calling orders in Italian. Elena worked and said nothing. At 10:48 p.m., the last guests were leaving. She was cleaning the prep station when Harold's voice came from behind her. Elena. She turned. He was holding 2 wine glasses, and he had locked the service door behind him. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and her own heartbeat, which had become very loud. You know Cordelia's going to fire you anyway, he said. His voice was low, conversational, the way you might talk to someone about the weather. She's been looking for an excuse for weeks. I've seen it. The way she watches you with those kids. She hates you. He stepped closer. But I could put in a good word. I have power in this city. I know people. I could make sure you worked forever. If you were nice to me. Elena's hands were still wet. She could smell the dish soap on them, sharper than her own fear. I need to finish my work, she said. I'm talking to you, Harold said. His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. His palm was warm and damp. You think you have a choice? You think anyone gives a shit what you want? You're a nanny with no references, no family, nothing. No one is coming for you. No one even knows you exist. Elena yanked her arm back hard. He held for a moment, then released her, surprised by the force of her. She backed away toward the walk-in freezer. Harold laughed. The sound of his laughter followed her like a curse. That's right. Run. Go hide. But you can't hide forever. He came through the door after her. The walk-in freezer was a white room lined with steel shelves, the air so cold it burned going down her lungs. Elena's breath came out in white clouds. Harold filled the doorway, blocking her path back out. Come on, he said. Don't be dramatic. This could be simple. This could be good for you. His hand reached for her shoulder. Elena did not think. She moved. Her elbow came up hard and found his face, his nose specifically, and the crack of bone on bone echoed off the metal walls like a gunshot. Harold screamed. Blood poured down his face, bright red against his white shirt. Elena shoved him backward and ran for the door, but the sharp corner of the freezer's metal frame caught her arm as she passed, tearing through her uniform and into the skin beneath. She felt the rip of fabric and then the burn of exposed flesh meeting cold. She ran through the kitchen, through the restaurant's empty dining room, through a door that led into the back hallway. The summer storm was waiting outside, rain that came down in sheets, thunder that shook the windows, lightning that turned the world white for a single perfect moment. Elena stood in the downpour and tried to breathe. Her arm was bleeding. Her uniform was torn. Harold's voice was still screaming somewhere inside the restaurant. She had nowhere to go. She had $34 in her pocket and a drawing in her apron that belonged to a child who was not hers. She had 10 days before the hospital gave Oliver's surgery slot to someone else. She had burned the only job that paid her rent. She turned and ran back inside through the kitchen entrance, because the streets of Chicago at night were not safe for someone with nothing to lose, and because that drawing in her pocket felt like a reason to keep fighting even though she could not quite see it anymore through the tears. The back corridor was quiet. Then she heard them, footsteps on tile, slow and measured, the sound of men moving with purpose. Through the kitchen window, she glimpsed them, figures in dark suits, broad-shouldered and silent, emerging from the shadows like the rain had given them shape. One of them turned and looked directly at her. The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital smelled like antiseptic and fluorescent light. Elena sat in a plastic chair in the waiting area at 2:08 in the morning, her arm wrapped in fresh bandages courtesy of Lucian's first aid kit, her uniform still torn and stained. She held her phone in both hands like it might shatter. The screen showed a text from her sister Rebecca, "Surgery is confirmed. 6 days. They moved you up the list." "How did you move, Elena? How did you get $200,000? Elena didn't have an answer that made sense. She still didn't understand what had happened in that restaurant. One moment she was running from Harold Brennan's blood-stained hands. The next moment she was sitting across from a man whose name people whispered like a prayer or a curse, and he was asking her to care for his son. The phone buzzed. Another message. This one from an unknown number. Harold Brennan filed assault charges with the Chicago Police Department at 1:15 a.m. Cordelia Blackwood corroborated his statement. "You are being investigated for aggravated battery and theft. They're recommending your arrest within 48 hours. Elena's vision blurred. The chair beneath her felt like it was tilting. 48 hours. She had been fired, arrested, and sentenced before the sun came up. She didn't notice the black SUV pulling up outside the hospital entrance. Didn't notice the man in a charcoal suit stepping out, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in low Italian. By the time she looked up, Lucian was standing in front of her, still in his restaurant clothes, still radiating the kind of controlled danger that made the hospital staff unconsciously step away from his path. "Your sister's hospital account received the surgery deposit," he said without preamble. "Confirmed by their finance department at 2:22 a.m. Oliver's valve replacement is scheduled for 6 days from now. The best surgeon in the Midwest, paid in full." Elena stood on unsteady legs. "Why are you here?" "It's the middle of the night." "Because you're facing arrest in less than 48 hours, and I don't accept that outcome." His voice was like gravel, like something ground smooth by pressure and time. "Harold Brennan sexually assaulted you. You defended yourself. That's not a crime, that's survival. But Cordelia Blackwood, the woman I work for, she's backing his story. She owns the restaurant. She owns everything." Elena's hands were shaking. "He's her manager. He's her friend. I'm nobody. I'm just the girl who sleeps in their closet and raises their children." Lucian's eyes went cold. "You stopped being nobody when you walked into my restaurant bleeding and asked about the medical equipment instead of asking for mercy. You stopped being nobody when you met my son and gave him something his money couldn't buy." He stepped closer. "Now you're going to stop being nobody in the eyes of every person who tried to erase you." 2 hours later, Elena sat in the penthouse apartment with Marco across from her at the kitchen table. Papers spread between them. Marco was 43, built like a wall, with tattoos visible at his wrists and a face that suggested he'd seen violence from every angle. He wore reading glasses and adjusted them as he scrolled through documents on a laptop. Cordelia Blackwood, Marco said, his voice surprisingly soft. Married to James Blackwood. He's a federal judge. They're in a custody battle over their 2 children. She's claiming he's unstable. He's claiming she's emotionally abusive to the kids. The case is heating up. Why does that matter? Elena asked. Because your assault claim, properly documented and filed, becomes evidence in his case against her. Marco looked up from the screen. It proves her judgment is compromised. It proves she'd back a predator if it benefited her. It proves she's the danger to those children, not him. Elena felt something shift in her chest. You're going to use me against her. We're going to use the truth against her, Marco corrected. There's a difference. He turned the laptop toward her. Security footage filled the screen. Black and white. Clear as day. Harold Brennan in the walk-in freezer, his hand moving toward Elena's body. Elena shoving him back. The moment of contact. The cut. The blood. The escape. Security camera. Elena whispered. 4 of them in that kitchen. Cordelia Blackwood knows about every single one. Which means she watched that footage before she called her lawyer. Marco's jaw tightened. She didn't call to protect her restaurant. She called to protect Brennan. Which means he has something on her, or she's just cruel enough to hurt anyone convenient. At 6:15 a.m., Lucian stood in Michael's bedroom watching his son sleep. The boy's breathing was even, peaceful, the first truly restful sleep in months. In the other room, Elena was asleep on the couch, her bandaged arm draped carefully across her body. In the kitchen, Marco was on the phone with 3 separate lawyers, each being told to prepare criminal defense, defamation counterclaim, and civil suit paperwork. Franco appeared in the doorway, moving like smoke. Boss. You need to hear this. They walked to the study. Franco played a recording from his phone. Audio. Elena's voice, then Harold's voice, then the sickening silence of struggle. She was wearing a wire. Lucian asked. No. Hospital security. They installed a system in the freezer last month after some food went missing. Audio and video. Everything's documented. Every word. Every threat he made to her. Franco's voice was steady. We have the legal ammunition. Cordelia Blackwood backing this story knowing the truth, that's conspiracy. That's aiding and abetting. That's her medical record showing 3 times she's filed false complaints against employees who wouldn't take her abuse. Lucian was quiet for a long moment. How long until the police come for Elena? 46 hours, give or take. Then we don't wait for them, Lucian said. His voice had gone quiet. That was always worse. We move first. Publicly. Completely. By the time those detectives try to serve her arrest warrant, it won't exist anymore. At 8:08 a.m., the Chicago Police Department received a formal complaint from a federal prosecutor. The evidence was undeniable. The security footage was pristine. The recording was clear. Harold Brennan's arrest warrant was issued within the hour for sexual assault, attempted rape, and aggravated battery. But that was just the beginning. By 10:33 a.m., Judge James Blackwood's lawyer had filed a motion in family court. The filing included everything: Cordelia's collusion with a known predator, her willingness to destroy a victim to protect her interests, her pattern of filing false complaints against domestic employees. By noon, the custody ruling had shifted. James was awarded temporary primary custody pending a full hearing. By 1:44 p.m., Cordelia's name was being whispered in country clubs and law offices across the city. Elena didn't see any of it. She was asleep upstairs with Michael, the boy's head resting on her shoulder as she read graphic novels aloud in different voices. When she reached the dramatic climax, the hero's final stand against impossible odds, Michael interrupted her. "Do you think real people can do that?" he asked. His voice was small. "Uncertain. Stand against impossible odds and actually win." Elena closed the book carefully. "I think real people do it all the time. They just don't have theme music or special effects. Their victories look like small moments. Like a doctor saying your heart can be fixed. Like someone believing in you when nobody else does." Michael looked at her directly. His dark eyes were serious. "Are you going to stay with us?" The question hung between them. Elena thought of the arrest warrant that didn't exist anymore. The charges that had been withdrawn. The lawyer whose fees Lucian had already paid, a man named William Chen who'd taken her case with the intensity of someone who'd been personally insulted by her treatment. "Yes," Elena said. "I'm going to stay with you." At 6:24 p.m., Lucian met with William Chen in his office downtown. The lawyer was thin, sharp, in his 50s, and angry. Righteously angry. "The case is airtight," Chen said, spreading papers across his mahogany desk. "Harold Brennan is being booked for sexual assault. Cordelia Blackwood is facing conspiracy charges and the custody hearing is already swinging. But what you've done here is create a liability." "Explain," Lucian said. "You've removed the victim from danger and provided her with resources. That's the right thing. But it also makes you look like you have a personal stake in this outcome. Like you're using your resources to manipulate the legal system." Chen leaned back. "The prosecution loves that narrative because it gives them an angle. It also, however, makes you a very protective man with significant resources and no tolerance for predators. That narrative works both ways." Lucian stood and walked to the window. Chicago spread beneath him, lights beginning to glow as evening fell. "I do have a personal stake. Elena came into my restaurant bleeding and terrified and still asked about my son. She's the only good thing that's happened to that boy in 3 years. I'm not ashamed of protecting her." "Then we lean into it," Chen said. "We let the public know exactly what she meant to your family. We position her not as a vulnerable victim but as someone valuable enough to fight for. We turn her assault into proof of her character instead of evidence of her weakness." The court filing went public at 7:15 p.m. Within minutes, local news outlets were running the story. Within an hour, the Chicago Tribune had published a feature. Within 2 hours, the story had spread to national outlets. The narrative was simple and devastating: a young nanny protecting children from a predator, standing up to her employer's corruption, finding safety with a man powerful enough to matter. By midnight, 374,000 people had shared the story. Harold Brennan sat in a holding cell, terrified, watching his life disintegrate on a television mounted in the common area. Cordelia Blackwood sat in her lawyer's office, watching her carefully constructed social position collapse like a house built on rotting foundation. And in the penthouse above Lucian's restaurant, Elena Hartley sat on the edge of Michael's bed, watching him sleep, her bandaged arm resting on the child's shoulder, understanding that everything had changed. The boy's fingers curled around her hand even in sleep. Like he was afraid she might disappear. Like he'd already learned that good things don't stay. Elena leaned forward and whispered a promise into the darkness. "I'm not going anywhere." Downstairs, Lucian listened to the rain begin, another storm rolling in from Lake Michigan. He thought about the moment Elena had walked into his restaurant. How broken she'd looked. How unbroken her spirit had remained. How she'd asked about his son before asking about herself. Marco appeared with a drink. They stood in silence as thunder rolled across the city. "The police are closing their investigation," Marco said quietly. "By tomorrow morning, all charges will be formally dismissed. The evidence against Brennan is overwhelming. Cordelia Blackwood is facing her own legal consequences in family court." Lucian didn't respond. He was thinking about how justice never feels clean enough. How there's always more that could be done, more damage that could be inflicted. But then he thought about Michael smiling for the first time in months. About Elena asleep downstairs with his son's hand holding hers like a promise. Maybe that was justice enough. Sometimes one hand reaching out at the right moment can change an entire life. The summer sun cut through the penthouse windows at 3:17 in the afternoon, and Elena Hartley stood motionless with her palms pressed against the glass, watching her life disintegrate on the street below. Down there, beyond the gleaming facades and expensive landscaping of North Michigan Avenue, a police car sat parked in front of Lucian's restaurant. Harold Brennan gestured aggressively at two uniformed officers, his mouth moving in words Elena could not hear but understood perfectly. The assault charges. The arrest warrant. Oliver's surgery in 4 days, and she would be in a cell. Her hands trembled against the cold glass. Not from fear of prison, she had survived worse than prison. But Oliver. Her nephew needed her for the procedure. The surgeon's office had called 3 times that week to confirm she would be there. And Lucian's son, Michael, sleeping down the hall with his small fingers still curled around the edge of her cardigan like he was afraid she might vanish while he slept. Like he'd already learned that good people disappear. The edges of her vision blurred. For the first time since she was 17 years old and her mother abandoned her in a bus station in Gary, Indiana, Elena Hartley considered simply stopping. Stopping the fight. Stopping the endless sacrifice. The dark whisper came gentle and seductive, it would be so easy to let go. 6 stories down. So easy. Then she felt small fingers grab her hand. Michael had wheeled himself across the marble floor without making a sound. His small face was fierce and terrified. "Don't leave," he whispered. "Please don't leave like my mom did. You're the first person who stayed." Elena closed her eyes. She knelt by the wheelchair, her knees hitting the floor hard. "I'm not going anywhere," she promised, even though she had no idea how she would keep that promise. Even though downstairs, the police were waiting. Downstairs, Lucian Moretti descended the marble staircase in a black suit that cost more than Elena's entire year of savings. His expression was carved from ice. The restaurant's private dining room had become a courtroom, and Harold Brennan stood in the center with his smirking face, flanked by detectives Rivera and Chang. Cordelia Blackwood had arrived too, designer dress, perfectly styled dark hair, the kind of woman who believed her money was armor. "Mr. Moretti," she said coolly, extending a hand he did not take. "I apologize for the disruption, but Elena Hartley attacked my manager. We're simply following proper legal channels. I'm sure you understand how these situations must be handled." Lucian looked at her for 3 long seconds. When he spoke, his voice was like a blade wrapped in ice. "Elena Hartley resigned from your employment 5 days ago. She now works for me. But that's not what you need to understand, Cordelia. What you need to understand is that you've been under federal investigation since March." Harold's face drained of color. Cordelia's smile tightened like a wire drawn too tight. Marco stepped forward with a thick file folder. He handed it to Detective Rivera without a word. The detective's eyes moved across the first page, and his expression shifted. "Where did this come from?" he asked quietly. "Bank records," Lucian said. "Employment records. Testimony from 6 women you either harassed or had harassed on your behalf, Harold. 6 women who have filed formal complaints. The FBI has been building their case since the first complaint was filed. 3 months of surveillance. Recorded conversations. Falsified time cards showing wage theft totaling $47,000. Tips stolen from your servers. And Cordelia, the FBI is particularly interested in how you've been using restaurant funds to finance your personal legal fees. Tax evasion. Wire fraud. Your divorce attorney is cooperating with federal prosecutors, by the way. He's been very helpful about explaining your financial arrangements." Cordelia's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. "This is absurd. I have lawyers who are currently being served with subpoenas," Lucian continued. The restaurant doors opened. FBI agents in tactical gear poured in like a storm rolling off Lake Michigan. 12 men, their badges gleaming, their movements practiced and efficient. Harold Brennan made a run for the kitchen. He made it 3 steps. 2 agents tackled him so hard the air exploded from his lungs. He hit the marble floor with a crack that sounded like a branch breaking in winter. "I'll tell you everything," he screamed as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "She made me do it. Cordelia forced me. Ask anyone. She controlled everything." Cordelia reached for her phone. An agent took it from her hand without breaking eye contact. "You have the right to remain silent," the lead agent said, and those words seemed to awaken something in her. The careful composure cracked. Her perfectly applied makeup began to run. "My children," she gasped. "My children are at their school. Someone needs to." "They're with their father," Lucian said quietly. "As of 6 o'clock this morning. Permanent custody was granted by Judge Harrison. The evidence we provided was comprehensive." Cordelia lunged toward Lucian, her face contorted. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. My family has power in this city. My connections are being investigated," the FBI agent interrupted. "Cordelia Blackwood, you're under arrest for federal tax fraud, wire fraud, labor law violations, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." They cuffed her wrists. She was still screaming as they led her away, her voice echoing through the restaurant like a wounded animal that finally understood it had been cornered. Outside, the media had assembled. Cameras. Reporters. The story was already spreading. By the time she reached the federal vehicle, her photograph was on 3 news outlets. The woman who had tried to bury Elena Hartley's complaint, who had protected Harold Brennan for 3 years, who had stolen $412,000 from the business she claimed to own, she was being led away in handcuffs while her carefully constructed reputation burned. Harold Brennan was dragged out next. The other servers from the restaurant lined the sidewalk. The 6 women he had harassed, had cornered, had made feel unsafe in their own workplace. One woman spat at his feet. Another stood with her arms crossed, watching him with the kind of satisfaction that comes from justice finally, impossibly arriving. Harold's face was the purple color of a bruise. He was weeping openly, his carefully groomed appearance destroyed by terror. 40 years minimum, Marco whispered to Lucian as they watched from the restaurant's entrance. Federal charges. The evidence is airtight. Recordings, bank statements, testimony from all 6 women. The prosecutors told me this morning they don't expect it to go to trial. He'll take a plea deal by next week." Lucian nodded, watching Harold being shoved into a federal vehicle. The man who had cornered Elena in a freezing walk-in, who had left her bleeding and terrified, was now bleeding from a cut above his eye where he'd hit the marble floor. Justice never feels clean. But sometimes it feels necessary. Upstairs in the penthouse, Elena watched it unfold from the window. Michael sat beside her in his wheelchair, his small hand holding hers. She could see the police cars, the FBI agents, the crowd gathering on the sidewalk. She could see Harold being led away in handcuffs. She could see Cordelia screaming. Marco appeared in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that looked like respect. "It's over," he said simply. "Both of them are in federal custody. The investigation is closed. All charges against you have been dismissed. You're safe, Elena. You and Oliver are safe." Elena's knees buckled. She sat down hard on the edge of Michael's bed, and the tears came, not the careful tears she had learned to control, but the kind of tears that come when you've been holding your breath for so long you'd forgotten how to breathe. Michael reached out and wrapped his small arms around her neck as best he could from his wheelchair. His voice was fierce and certain. "I told you. My dad doesn't let people hurt his family." The word hung there. Family. Not employee. Not the girl he'd hired to care for him. Family. Lucian appeared in the doorway, still in his black suit, still carrying the cold precision of a man who had just dismantled his enemies with the efficiency of a surgeon. He looked at Elena holding his son. He looked at Michael with joy in his eyes for the first time in months, real joy, not the forced brightness of a child trying to protect his parent from worry. Something in Lucian's expression shifted, softened, became almost unrecognizable. The phone in his pocket buzzed. A text from his lawyer, both secured in federal facilities. Bail denied. Trial not expected. They're finished. Lucian didn't look at the phone. He was watching Elena hold his son, watching Michael's fingers curl into her hair, watching a woman who had been invisible become suddenly, unmistakably real. Real enough to matter. Real enough to change everything. Outside, the Chicago summer sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The rain had finally stopped. After days of storms, the weather had cleared, and the city sparkled like it was celebrating too, like even the sky knew that sometimes justice arrives like a sudden sunrise, and sometimes one hand reaching out at the right moment can change an entire life. The penthouse hospital room smelled like antiseptic and hope. Oliver, 6 years old, lay in the recovery bed with tubes still connected to his small chest, but the monitors showed what the surgeon had promised, a heart that was finally, mercifully, working the way a child's heart should work. Elena sat beside him, her hand covering his, afraid to move, afraid that any sudden motion might disturb the miracle that had just happened. 12 hours of surgery. 12 hours of sitting in a waiting room in Milwaukee, watching the clock on the wall tick forward with a slowness that felt like torture. The surgery had cost exactly $200,000. $200,000 that Elena had scraped together over 3 years of double shifts, of eating other people's leftovers, of counting every single penny while her nephew's heartbeat grew weaker and more irregular with each passing month. Then Lucian had arrived at the hospital. Not with fanfare. Not with his men in black suits standing guard. He had come quietly, carrying coffee in paper cups, and sat beside her in that waiting room for all 12 hours without saying much of anything. He had just been there. Present. Solid like an anchor in a storm. When the surgeon emerged with his mask still around his neck and said, "The surgery was successful. Your nephew is going to live a full, healthy life," Elena had felt her knees buckle. She had collapsed forward, and Lucian had caught her, held her while she sobbed into his chest, this man she had known for less than 3 months, this man who had entered her life on the worst night of her existence and somehow became the person she trusted most in the world. His men had watched from a discreet distance. Marco and Franco exchanged a look that said everything. In all their years working for Lucian Moretti, they had never seen him hold anyone like that. Gentle. Protective. Almost tender. Now, back in Chicago, 3 weeks had passed since Harold Brennan and Cordelia Blackwood had been arrested. The federal prosecutors had moved fast. The evidence was overwhelming. Brennan's assault on Elena had been documented. Blackwood's embezzlement and conspiracy to commit fraud had been meticulously catalogued by Lucian's team of lawyers and accountants. Both were now in federal facilities facing sentences that would stretch decades into their futures. Neither would ever hurt anyone again. Oliver's eyes fluttered open. Still groggy from the anesthesia, but aware. "Elena?" His voice was small, uncertain, the way 5-year-olds talk when they're waking from bad dreams. "I'm right here, baby." She leaned close, letting him see her face clearly. "The surgery is done. Your heart is fixed. You're going to be okay." Oliver's eyes filled with tears, but they were different tears. Relief tears. Survival tears. "Does it hurt?" he asked. "A little bit. But that will go away. You're so brave, Oliver. You were so brave today." The door opened and Lucian entered, still in his black suit, his tie loosened, his hair slightly disheveled from running his hand through it during those endless hours of waiting. He had aged during those 12 hours. Lines had deepened around his eyes. But when he looked at Oliver, when he saw that the boy was awake and conscious and going to live, something shifted in his expression. It softened like winter giving way to spring. He came to the bedside and stood beside Elena. His hand found the small of her back and rested there, and the intimacy of the gesture made Elena's breath catch. Not romantic intimacy. Something deeper. Something that meant, "I see you. I acknowledge you. I stand beside you. How are you feeling? Lucian asked Oliver, his voice gentle but still carrying that low rumble that made people listen. Tired, Oliver said. And my chest feels weird. That's normal. The surgeon fixed the part of your heart that wasn't working properly. Your body is adjusting. Lucian paused. You're going to get to do things now that you couldn't do before. You're going to run and play and have a full life. That surgery gave you that. Oliver's small hand reached out and grabbed Lucian's finger. The gesture was unconscious, the way children reach for safety, for comfort. Are you my mommy's boyfriend? Oliver asked with the blunt innocence of a 6-year-old. Elena's face went red. Lucian didn't laugh, but something warm moved through his eyes. No, he said simply. But I'm something. I'm the person who loves your aunt and wants to make sure you both have everything you need. It was the closest either of them had come to naming what was happening between them. Elena felt tears prick her eyes again, but she blinked them back. She had cried enough in the past 3 weeks. Happy tears could wait until later. The next morning, they flew back to Chicago. Oliver was released from the hospital with a list of instructions, follow-up appointments, and a physical therapist's recommendation that he take things slowly for the next month. Elena had requested time off from Cordelia's household, though Cordelia was no longer there to hear the request. A replacement family had been found, and their children had new caregivers. Elena's employment with that household was simply gone, erased like it had never existed. But that didn't matter anymore. Because in the penthouse above Lucian's legitimate restaurant, in a space that cost more per month than Elena had earned in a year at her previous positions, there was room for Oliver to recover. There was a private nurse. There was physical therapy equipment. There was quiet and safety and people who loved him. Michael was waiting when they arrived, positioned by the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Chicago's skyline. Lucian's son, 11 years old, paralyzed from the waist down, had spent the past 3 weeks undergoing his own transformation. His physical therapist reported that he was making progress, real, measurable progress, that doctors had said was unlikely. His motivation had changed. His will to improve had returned. When Oliver came through the door in Lucian's arms, Michael's face lit up like a lantern. "You're back," Michael said. "How do you feel?" Oliver was placed carefully on the couch. "I'm okay. I'm going to be better soon." Michael rolled his wheelchair closer. "I made you something while you were gone." He held up a drawing. Michael had discovered that while his legs didn't work, his hands were just fine, and he had spent hours creating detailed artwork. This drawing showed 4 figures holding hands. 3 were labeled, Michael, Oliver, Elena. The 4th, drawn in red marker, had a question mark next to it. "That's supposed to be you," Michael said to Lucian, pointing at the figure with the question mark. "But I didn't know what color to make you." Lucian looked at that drawing for a long moment. Elena watched his expression shift, soften, become almost unrecognizable. This man who had built an empire on violence and vengeance and absolute control, standing before his son's drawing with something that looked an awful lot like hope. "You can make me green," Lucian said finally. "Make me green." Michael picked up a green marker and filled in the final figure. "There. Now we're all here." That night, after both boys were asleep, Elena and Lucian stood on the penthouse balcony. The Chicago wind was gentle now. September was turning to October, and the air carried that particular crispness that meant seasons were shifting, that change was inevitable. "I've been thinking," Lucian said, his hands gripping the railing in front of them. "About the night you came through those kitchen doors covered in blood." "I try not to think about that night," Elena said softly. "I know. But I have to, because that's when everything changed. You were terrified. You had every reason to run, to hide, to protect yourself. But instead you stood there and held a drawing your nephew had made, and you didn't move, even though my men had guns." Elena turned to look at him. "I was too scared to move." "No," Lucian said. "Scared people run. You stood because you were brave. Because protecting that drawing, protecting the memory of your family, mattered more than your own safety. He turned to face her. I've spent 15 years in this world, Elena. 15 years of blood and control and vengeance. And I'd never seen anything as powerful as that moment. A girl with nothing standing against everything. What are you saying? Elena asked, though she thought she knew. I'm saying that you saved my son. Not just his life, his spirit. Michael was drowning and I couldn't reach him. No amount of money or power could fix what was broken inside him. But you could. You and Oliver. You showed him that people are worth loving, that family isn't always what you're born into. You saved me first, Elena whispered. Oliver would be dead. I would be in jail or worse. You gave me everything. Then we're even, Lucian said. We saved each other. He pulled a small box from his jacket pocket. Elena's breath caught, but when he opened it, it wasn't what she expected. Inside was a key. The penthouse, Lucian said. I'm putting it in your name. Yours and the boys. So you always have a home. So you're never trapped again. Elena took the key with trembling fingers. It was real. Metal and weight and permanence. Lucian, I can't. You can. You will. He stepped closer, cupped her face in his hands. I know we haven't defined what this is. What we are to each other. But I know I don't want to do life without you. You walked into my world bleeding and broken, and somehow you put both of us back together. We put each other back together, Elena said. That's what matters. When he kissed her, it was soft and slow, a promise written in touch instead of words. 3 weeks later, the legal proceedings concluded. Harold Brennan received a sentence of 25 years in federal prison. Cordelia Blackwood received 40 years. Both would spend the remainder of their functional lives behind bars, their empire dismantled, their secrets exposed to the light. The Chicago newspapers ran the story for exactly 3 days before moving on to other scandals, other injustices. But for Elena, those headlines meant something simple: she was safe. Oliver was safe. Michael was safe. 6 months passed. Winter arrived, soft and clean, with snow falling against the penthouse windows like blessings. A Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated by Michael and Oliver working together, their hands creating something beautiful from simple ornaments and colored lights. Elena was cooking dinner, real food, prepared with love, not salvaged from garbage or rationed across impossibly tight budgets, when Lucian came home from a meeting with his legitimate business ventures. The restaurant below was thriving. He had quietly begun transitioning his empire toward legal enterprises, real estate, hospitality, technology investments. Marco and Franco had adapted. His men understood that loyalty meant following their boss wherever he led, even if that direction was toward something approaching redemption. "How was your day?" Elena asked as he kissed her cheek, a gesture so ordinary and beautiful that it made her heart ache. "Long. Better now." He pulled a small box from his pocket. The same one, actually, but now it held something different. A ring. Simple. Elegant. Real. "Elena," he said, and the fact that he was nervous, that this man who commanded armies was actually nervous, made her love him even more. "I know we've been taking this slowly. I know you needed time to trust that this was real. But I can't wait anymore. Will you marry me?" Elena said yes before he even finished the question. They were married 3 months later in a small ceremony with just the important people, Marco and Franco, standing as witnesses, the priest who had known Lucian since childhood, Oliver and Michael in their best clothes, both of them crying happy tears. Elena wore a simple white dress and carried a single white rose. Lucian wore a black suit, and when he looked at his bride, his men could see the transformation clearly. This wasn't the dangerous, controlled man they had worked for. This was someone who had chosen to become something new. The drawing that Oliver had made 6 months ago, the one with 3 stick figures that became 4, now hung framed on the refrigerator next to the one Michael had created, for people holding hands outside a building labeled home. 1 year after that terrible night in the restaurant, Elena stood in the penthouse kitchen, 6 months pregnant. The life she was carrying was a new beginning, a symbol of everything that had transformed since the night she ran through a kitchen door covered in blood and desperate. Lucian found her at the window, her hand on her belly, watching the snow fall over Chicago. "What are you thinking?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "That I walked into your life with nothing but $34 and a drawing," Elena said. "And I'm walking out with everything that matters." "You didn't walk out," Lucian corrected gently. "You walked in. Into our life. Into our home. And you stayed." That night, the 4 of them, soon to be 5, sat down to dinner together. Oliver told elaborate stories about his first-grade class. Michael discussed his wheelchair basketball team with the kind of passion that made Lucian's chest swell with pride. Elena laughed at the chaos of it all, the beautiful, messy, ordinary miracle of a family. This was what salvation looked like. Not dramatic. Not heroic. Just quiet. Steady. Real. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, like and share this video with the people you love. Every comment you leave is a precious source of motivation. We wish all of you good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace.